Hello and welcome to today's Cybersecurity Summit Power Hour. My name is Rick. I will be in the background answering any WebEx technical questions. We have a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties joining the WebEx session, please submit a question using the Q&A panel. During the presentation, all participants will remain in listen-only mode. And as a reminder, this event is being recorded for rebroadcast. We'll be holding a Q&A session at the conclusion of each of today's presentations. We encourage you to submit written questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A panel at the bottom right of your screen. Please type your questions into the text field and hit send. Please keep the dropdown as all panelists. With that, we invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Bradford Rann, CEO of the Cybersecurity Summit. Bradford, you have the floor.
Terrific. Thank you, Rick, and thank you all for joining us. This is our power hour for this region of the country, although anyone from around the globe can join us. But specifically, we're going to be focusing on law enforcement that is around this part of the United States. Please, if you have any questions for our experts, just submit them in the chat bar, and we will try to get to as many as we can. If you stay with us for the entire duration, in 2 days, you'll get a certificate for CPE credits. Additionally, many people ask about the slides. Most of the slides will be available also within 2 to 3 days on cybersummitusa.com. Again, as Rick said, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to a very interactive, fast-paced session here, and we know your time is valuable, so we're going to get to the facts right now. We're going to kick it off with Ryan McFarland. He's with the FBI for over 16 years. Ryan, can you hear me?
Can you hear me, Bradford?
Yes, I can hear you. Great. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for your service to our country, and you've got the floor. Ryan Kallenberg, are you there, Ryan?
I'm here. Good morning.
Okay. Good morning. Hey, there you go. Good to see you.
Likewise.
Okay, great. Okay, you've got the floor. Thank you so much for joining us. And we've got 300 executives waiting to listen to your wisdom on cybersecurity in our new COVID-ridden world, huh?
Fantastic. And just to clarify, I've got about 20 minutes for Q&A.
Yeah, 20 minutes or so, and then a few minutes for Q&A. But no one's
fantastic.
And no one's going to cut off your video.
Sounds great. And if anyone wants to throw any Q&A into the chat, I would love to take it during this topic, which I think is a fascinating one. It certainly affects every single type of organization out there, and builds on a lot of the things that the other Ryan was just talking about. So I will be touching on EMITET and Fin7 and all our friends on that front. But I wanted to actually highlight a couple of things just to do kind of a year in review from a cybercriminal perspective in terms of how they do one of their most key forms of targeting, which is, of course, email threats. Now, if you look at the Verizon DBIR, I think the number went up from 94% to 96% of malware entering organizations through the email channel in the new version that just came out a couple of weeks ago. And if you break down kind of what that malware looks like, you actually see a lot of the same themes that Ryan talked about a minute ago. We've actually seen a bit of an equalization in payloads, though. It used to be 90% commodity stuff, bankers, downloaders, first-stage payload ransomware, that would all kind of work in an automated fashion. And Ryan touched on this quite a bit. The monetization of compromised endpoints has changed pretty substantially. So those downloaders are actually pretty modular, and they can do more things than they used to be able to do. And stealers, that's credential stealing malware, those often have downloader capability. How you categorize these sorts of things is a little bit difficult in a world of modular malware, particularly because the threats that we're really genuinely concerned about the most are probably actually going to involve a human attacker behind a keyboard. And that is a very, very different thing to defend yourself against than a piece of malware that really only has what's coded into its DNA as its playbook. And the shift from basically fully automated attacks to much more manual attacks and monetization on a different sort of scale, basically higher impact but fewer organizations, has really driven the landscape. You can see rats, keyloggers, backdoors, all showing up in volumes that we really haven't seen as a percentage of the overall global threat landscape. Now, there's a couple of other ways to look at this data. Obviously, there's been a huge amount of chatter about COVID phishing. Everyone sort of expected to see a big spike in March and April that didn't actually happen. I have a couple of reasons for that, one of which actually involves our friends at Emotet. But the payloads that were using COVID in their lures really also spanned the gamut. You had those downloaders and bankers. You had a lot of targeted rats leveraging that. You had a lot of stealers. You had pure credential phishing with no malware associated with it at all, really just going after mostly Office 365 credentials. And a little bit of APT malware from nation states also leveraging COVID as a lure. That's something that is maybe TLP, a little darker color for this particular webinar, but it certainly was happening to some extent. And on the COVID side of things, one of the things that was super effective here was the social engineering. The click rates on COVID attacks were just astronomically high compared to the packaged lures and the voicemail lures and all of the other stuff that you see used day in and day out. So actually, I think there's two good reasons for why we didn't actually see a spike in email threats despite so much talk about COVID-related email threats. One was that they were so successful that the attackers didn't need to send out campaigns that were quite as large to get enough compromised credentials and endpoints to do whatever their second stage operations were. And two, Emotet has actually been offline since February the 9th. There's a couple actors out there still using TrickBot, but our old enemies at Emotet have been dark now for, 3.5 months, which is not unprecedented for them. They occasionally, 4 months. Wow, it's late June already. That's not unprecedented. They often kind of recharge and retool, and they'll take months-long breaks to do that. But we're actually watching things every day to see if they spring back to life. Now, in terms of those lures with a little bit more specificity, you're probably not surprised to learn that packaged lures continue to dominate overall. UPS, which is an organization that does all of the right things to actually prevent its brand from being abused, still sees its brand abused pretty frequently, as does FedEx, DHL, and Maersk. It was interesting to see the CDC and the World Health Organization creep into the top of that list. If you look at it from a pure COVID phishing perspective, the CDC was the most abused brand, so to speak, with the World Health Organization and the Red Cross in that mix as well. I want to actually mention a key point here. The Department of Homeland Security issued what they call a binding operational directive a couple of years ago that every federal agency under its purview should authenticate its email. And that is something that you'd think everybody would do. Why wouldn't you actually tell the world where you send email from so you can't be easily spoofed? And actually, that was reasonably successful across the broader federal government. There was a bit of a kerfuffle last week when it came out that the CIA hadn't actually done DMARC, but almost everybody under DHS's purview has actually successfully authenticated their email, including the CDC, which had their brand abused in different ways. However, the World Health Organization was not actually authenticating its email. So you, me, anybody could send an email as an executive there, as maybe an informational alias from the WHO, and the email could come from who.int, and then it would be up to your email gateway to decide whether it was good or bad, because the WHO wasn't actually telling the world where its emails were supposed to be coming from and what keys it was supposed to be using to actually sign those emails. That's a really, really bad place to be in the middle of a pandemic. And there was a concerted sort of pressure campaign on the WHO to cut off this channel of abuse. I will admit I actually participated in that campaign. If you actually go to YouTube and search for DMARC WHO, DMARC being the standard by which we authenticate email, you'll find a video that somehow has north of 600,000 views the last I checked. done by Vox Media that features me and some other cybersecurity experts talking about why you can actually spoof the WHO, or why you could at the time, because the WHO actually got their act together, and now they are finally actually what we call a P=reject policy on the DMARC side. They're finally not being abused in that particular channel, although, of course, there are other tactics that work there. That is the one thing in my InfoSec career that my kids recognize as a success, because it has 600,000 views on YouTube, which is still an amazing stat for anything to do with email authentication or email threats in general. But I want to actually get into some of the actors behind the current landscape. As I mentioned, Emotet's gone dark. So who's actually in there filling that vacuum? Well, it's a mix of what we would call large crime actors, meaning a lot of the global groups that the other Ryan talked about, as well as more kind of business email compromise-oriented actors that do much more targeted things, often with a similar set of tooling, but really they're just trying to get in the middle of a wire transfer. And then some actors that do different stuff that are maybe more interesting in certain ways. So at any given point in time, some of them will be using COVID lures, and some of them, of course, won't. In this particular snapshot, you had threat actor 544. That's a group that mostly targets Europe. They were hitting Italy with a fake bill. Really good Italian lure, actually. Threat actor 511 hitting the US and the UK with another COVID lure, but it was a fake version of the Johns Hopkins map, which we're all, I think, paying a little bit closer attention to than we might have been doing 2 weeks ago. At the same time, you had a small crime actor, threat actor 2715, that operates out of the Middle East. They were targeting organizations in the United Arab Emirates with a WHO lure, and that was dropping, I believe, a commodity rat. At the same time, you had different actors that weren't bothering with COVID at all. Modest is an actor out of Nigeria. They have terrible OPSEC, not like a lot of the actors that Ryan McFarland talked about. We know exactly where they are in Nigeria, although they're, of course, a little bit hard to reach for law enforcement for a whole host of reasons. They are primarily BEC focused, but they love commodity rats and keyloggers as well. They're still using things like Agent Tesla, which have been around for a long, long time. But you can repack them in ways that they will get through a lot of security controls in relatively trivial ways that don't require a lot of technical sophistication. At the same time, making this volume chart was a group we call Silent Librarian that has actually also been indicted by the DOJ, doing excellent work. This is part of an Iranian organization called the Mabna Institute, and it's the one APT actor that we can talk about reasonably freely because we're not really sharing anything incredibly sensitive here, although they're still dangerous. They go after higher education, by and large, universities, and they clone library login pages using lures about overdue books or other things that actually still matter at higher education institutions. And even in the worst throes of the pandemic in Iran, they were still actually operating somehow. So they were all pretty much successfully figuring out how to work from home. That actor uses its access that it gets to these high-profile university accounts to not only compromise what those individuals, often professors or researchers, have access to, but also as pivot points to launch further attacks with the rest of the Iranian Nexus actors that they are broadly part of. Now, the other actor that I think is worth calling out in that landscape is one we call VEERS, or Threat Actor 4901. They actually go after VPN creds and are good at phishing second factors, and they're good at really cloning VPN login pages, and they're very, very interested in telecommunications targets. So their tradecraft, they just sort of got lucky, right? Everyone's moving to work from home. The VPN becomes a much more popular tool, and they're already set up to take advantage of it. We saw them certainly ramp their activity in the middle of this pandemic. The malware side is a bit interesting, though, when you get to the aspect that has changed the least during COVID, which is how all this stuff works. And you will not probably be surprised, or you might be surprised to learn that almost none of it works via a technical vulnerability. What we're talking about is threats that work via human vulnerability. The number one exploit technique was PowerShell, meaning sending somebody code and asking them to run it. The same is true for that second technique, which I'm not really going to try and pronounce. It's a technique called squibbly-do. XL4 macros, LCG kit builds malicious macros into documents, compressed executables, VBA macros, VBS macros, shortcuts. That's all just sending people code and asking them to run it. It is a huge, huge departure from what we had seen historically, where there are reliable vulnerabilities that you have reliable exploits for. In modern operating systems, without Flash and Java or any of the millstones that used to be around our necks from a security perspective, attackers just don't have that anymore. The only vulnerability that's still here, 2017 11.882, which is an equation editor vulnerability. The reason it's still here is because it's a reliable exploit that Microsoft really never fixed. They sort of acknowledged that it was a problem and gave you ways to turn off equation editor, which is a part of Office that nobody uses. But they didn't actually fix the vulnerability, which is the reason 2.5+ years later that it's the only CVE that actually still makes this chart. So the malware landscape, once you get into the families, is also fairly interesting. I think Ryan McFarland mentioned a bunch of these. Dridex is still kicking around in relatively high volume. Agent Tesla is a keylogger/stealer that's been around since, I want to say, 2014. GULoader is relatively new. ZLoader's got some new capabilities, but that's that first stage downloader payload that can then do something more interesting if it's sold on to a different group. You can think of this as part of the, the Emotet trickbot to Ryuk, or sometimes even in between, you'll have PowerShell Empire or some other red teaming tool, Metasploit, often seeing Cobalt Strike these days since that was cracked as an intermediate payload for something like a big game ransomware attack. And a bunch of other malware families has just been around for a really long time. And the reason that there's no innovation here is because there really doesn't need to be. If all of these attacks are being activated based on social engineering, and you can change the malware enough to get through most of the defenses, you don't actually need to do anything new. So these malware families certainly have seen periodic updates. Dridex has been with us since, I want to say, 2014, and has some of its roots in Zeus, which goes even further back than that. And really, it still is it is completely viable for a cyber criminal to rely on these tools. So when you're dealing with a threat landscape like that, how do you understand it? How do you protect yourself? Well, first is understanding kind of the likely things that we face. And this actually, I think, gets to some of the questions that Bradford was asking Ryan. What is going on from a remote work standpoint? Well, you certainly have your users targeted by phishing. They might be targeted by sort of imposter BEC style emails. Those will often leverage COVID-19 lures, although that's finally dropping off a little bit now that we get into June. Some of that actually has evolved into what are our processes for going back to work lures. And in general, we don't have people who necessarily know how to take InfoSec home with them. So the awareness levels aren't really that high. Ryan mentioned this point as well. The visibility is a very different proposition when you have people going PC to home Wi-Fi router, maybe via VPN, maybe not, to SaaS application, right? And if that application lives in the cloud and you're using Office 365, your traditional sources of visibility on the network might have gone pretty dark. On the other hand, what's happening inside Office 365 is very interesting because that's where your data went, and that's certainly where all the business email compromise actors are going. They want to read your email, figure out how a wire makes its way from point A to point B, and figure out how they can get themselves in the middle of it. And then, of course, those devices themselves might have an uncertain security posture, especially if you've had to go BYOD in order to maintain business continuity. Now, with those same devices not being on the corporate network, there is a higher risk for downloaders pulling down secondary payloads. A lot of that malware is not actually proxy aware, but when you're just sitting behind a home Wi-Fi router, that doesn't really matter anymore. And the worst case scenario probably, though, is the traditional VPN. If you have that compromised machine that is now allowed access to an unsegmented corporate network via a VPN with a relatively risky work from home user behind that, that unfortunately becomes a really problematic scenario. So what can you do in a world like that? Well, first, obviously, stop people from getting phished insofar as you can. You can never do 100% there, but email protection and awareness training certainly matters. You might want to do slightly more aggressive things that work from a network perspective, even though you don't have the classic network control that you had once when people were in the office. Web isolation is becoming incredibly popular as a way to do that. Also, getting that visibility on the endpoint itself, whether it's to monitor for insiders doing risky things with data or to look at data exfiltration more broadly. Again, that has really shifted in terms of its center of gravity from the network to these things that are more aligned with work from home. Ryan mentioned endpoint. Certainly, I think cloud is part of that as well. And then, of course, there's the buzzword zero trust. And actually, it's a buzzword that bears mentioning, I think, in this context, because you don't want to just poke a hole into the traditional on-premises network if you haven't gotten rid of your data centers yet with a traditional VPN that gives everybody access to everything. That user probably needs access to a small set of defined resources. So even if you can't prevent every single user from getting compromised, you can absolutely contain the blast radius. Gartner calls this space zero trust network access, but there's all kinds of ways to limit access to really only what that user should have access to. And that works just as well in the cloud as it works with a legacy asset in a data center. And architecturally, I think is where a lot of people want to go. So a good way to leverage this crisis. But let's get to the lures. Everyone always wants to see these phishing lures. This is my nomination for most evil phishing lure I've seen recently. This is playing to one of those anxieties that I think a lot of people have these days. Am I going to get fired? Right? And even worse, am I going to get fired via Zoom or WebEx or any of the other virtual meeting tools out there? This is actually a phishing attempt. You can see it's abusing Zoom's brand, and it actually goes after credentials. But it's basically saying the meeting purpose is contract suspension / termination trial. Please meet with HR and payroll administration right now. A lot of people are going to get fooled by this, and we probably shouldn't blame them. But it goes to just how important credential phishing is in the overall landscape. MFA is not broadly deployed, and certainly in a work-from-home scenario, that leaves holes open. Now, the second thing, though, that I mentioned in passing was sort of the Office 365 problem. The Office 365 problem is a multifaceted one because at this point in time, Office 365 is probably what you're protecting in your organization if you're in an InfoSec role or an IT role, but it's also probably what's attacking you. This is actually where we saw most malicious content hosted in the last couple of months. Office.com, Google Docs, Windows.net, SharePoint.com. Now, those are all compromised SharePoint accounts, but when the threat is coming from inside the building, so to speak, the attacker doesn't need a botnet. You don't need infrastructure. You have Office 365 to send your phishing email. You can just do it as a file sharing event out of OneDrive or SharePoint. It's an incredibly useful thing for an attacker to compromise, and this is actually one of the biggest trends in the landscape. This used to be the sort of thing that nation states pioneered. It has now filtered its way all the way down to the least sophisticated groups, but the threat most of the time is that you really want to worry about is that compromised third party, very often with a legitimate looking service that's going to be trusted from a network perspective. Now, some of these threats obviously have complicated multi-stage payloads, which make it a little harder for your EDR tools to catch them. I mentioned that RegServer32 exploit known as Squibbly-Do. This is an example of a COVID phishing email that was using a vulnerability with an OLE in it to actually drop PowerShell with a piece of malware called Lemon Tree. Business email compromise. Here's a COVID-related imposter message. Those are still certainly common in the landscape. Bunch of people test tested. This is, of course, in the early days when COVID was in a sort of different mindset for us all. People tested positive near me. I can't go out. Please email me back. My phone's not working. But actually, I wanted to get to this threat type because this is, to me, the most interesting. You see two examples. One is abusing OneDrive, and one is actually impersonating the government of Mexico. This is how attackers are getting around multi-factor authentication. These actually are malicious third-party apps that are both Azure apps, meaning they're in the Office 365 App Store, and they're hosted on O365 tenants. The one on the left is spoofing OneDrive. I believe it was OneDrive, the number 4 business, in terms of the name it was using. And it looks like a normal file sharing event. But if you click on this link, you don't actually go to a phishing site where the attacker grabs your credentials. You go to your actual IDP. That could be Microsoft, that could be Okta or OneLogin. You can log in with any credential you want. You can log in first factor, second factor, face, thumbprint, YubiKey. It doesn't matter because you're actually logging into the real site. What the attacker gets is not your credentials. The attacker gets an OAuth token that represents your credentials, and it doesn't expire and it doesn't get reset when those credentials get reset. And this is a really interesting way to attack Office 365 and G Suite accounts that are protected by MFA. The Mexico government one there, it is impersonating the health secretary. And I think this was actually part of an information gathering campaign. But the one on the left there, that was part of a cybercriminal activity that we've been tracking for a while. This really started ramping in November of last year, and now we've tracked about 140 apps that are sold in the cybercrime forums, often for as little as $1,000. This is very much cybercrime SaaS, as Ryan McFarland was referring to it. And those toolkits are really full-featured, and they are wonderfully good if you're a BEC actor and you're trying to use compromised Office 365 to host everything that you need to host and access everything that you need to access. Your phishing links, all hosted on Microsoft properties. Your phishing emails, all sent by Microsoft. Like, it's a fantastic deal if you're a cybercriminal. So briefly, in the number side of things, we're seeing about 300 million COVID phishing emails per month. Actually, we're up to about 350 total campaigns that we've tracked. And again, there are a wide variety of things that have evolved just sort of as the news cycle had evolved. Originally, we were just seeing mostly Asian organizations targeted, and now it's completely changed to going back to work procedures, and actually economic relief and stimulus related things have been going for a while. But it's all the same stuff. Malicious attachments, malicious URLs, actually more URLs, credential phishing, BEC, leveraging COVID in the file names and domain names, just sort of sprinkling it liberally like a seasoning across all of the same tradecraft as before. Emotet was actually the first one on the COVID bandwagon all the way back in January, but since then it's been kind of every actor under the sun. So we got through a lot of examples here, but this is one last one I wanted to show because it really does typify what we're currently facing. This is a Remcos RAT campaign that used two different lures. And actually, the COVID lure wasn't the good lure. The COVID lure there, you can see at the bottom, that was, oh, your package got to our warehouse, but because of COVID, you got to come to the warehouse physically to get it. Here's the automatic notification. Click on the attachment, which is actually an ISO image file, if you can believe it, which drops Remcos RAT. The other lure you can see there at the top, my attention was called that a customer was assaulted by one of your staff. I received the attached video in the email from an unknown source, and we haven't identified who did it. People are going to click on that. That's good social engineering. That's actually better than the COVID social engineering. And that really is kind of the landscape right now, right? Tricking people into running code, lures where the COVID lure might not even be the best lure, but it really just depends on the social engineering in order to be successful. And then Remcos RAT, that's not going to do you any good as a cyber criminal unless you're willing to put a human behind a keyboard to actually leverage that rat. Another quick one, the FMLA Act, this spoofing the Department of Labor, seeing a lot of that go around. That's been relatively broadly targeted. And then a final one on the Agent Tesla side. This is a really well done one, impersonating the WHO and targeted solely at one vertical. This is transportation and oil tankers, basically, and had these really complicated procedures for how you handle a potentially COVID-infected ship crew in a port. This is, again, a slightly better threat, but certainly in the same kind of category. Let's just briefly touch on emerging trends. Everyone around the world is now seeing offers of relief. Sometimes those are actually coming from spoofing private organizations, banks, credit card companies, and this is mostly a U.S. targeted threat type, although it's also present around the world. Super briefly, if you're going to actually stop this stuff, I have three simple recommendations. One, figure out how your people are being attacked. That's mostly probably email for most organizations. Oftentimes it'll be sort of spoofed imposter email. Sometimes it'll be malware and phishing coming in the front door. Figure out how your cloud accounts are being attacked. Password replay, password spray. Figure out how to lock those down, especially in a cloud context. Maybe actually you're really well secured and it's your personal webmail that becomes then the target. But either way, understand how your people are being attacked. And then again, this whole landscape works on human vulnerability, not technical vulnerability. So figuring out which of your users is likeliest to fall for the social engineering upon which these threats depend, unbelievably important data point, especially right now, particularly because the ones who are a little bit of the weaker members of the herd probably could use some more training. And then finally, lock down what the people that are most attacked and also most vulnerable have access to. If those people have access to your crown jewels, maybe get some more endpoint visibility on those boxes, whether it's EDR or whether it's an insider threat management tool. Figure out whether you can contain the blast radius of what they have access to on your internal network now that you have to provide work from home tools. Really figuring out then that third step, once you figured out who's getting targeted, who's vulnerable to that targeting, that last step is about protecting the things that they have access to. Now, before we go to Q&A, we have a ton of resources out there for that. We're stopping most of this stuff. Of course, many nines worth of the COVID phishing is pretty detectable at this point. If you happen to have one of our products, the campaigns are being tracked as COVID-19. If you are a network defender in the traditional sense, we've actually made the world's most popular IPS rule set, which is something that we run as Proofpoint. It's called Emerging Threats. There's a pro version and an open version in open source terms, that is. And all the COVID signatures are in the open source version if you're a practitioner. And we're continuing to publish lots and lots of updates on things that we find there. And then finally, I talked about identifying all of the people that are getting attacked in different ways. If you also are looking to better protect them, we have a partner offer with our friends at Okta to make sure that you can sort of raise the shields with MFA and single sign-on for highly attacked people. And it's an API-based integration. It can be turned on in 5 minutes. But with that, I would love to take any questions you might have.
Okay. All right, let me just open this up. Hey, I'm back. I always forget to open that little screen.
We're all constantly bouncing back and forth between the Zoom UI and the WebEx UI and the Teams UI. It's a wonder anyone can find anything.
Yeah, and with all of the scams that you just mentioned, it is actually amazing that there's not more, because with the rapid fire response rate to email, you click, you open, you click, you open, and you have no idea because you're not checking the validity, you're not checking the email address. And my office was almost a victim of that when my assistant got an email, hey, I need 1,000 Target gift cards for clients.
Yeah.
And I told, and she saw the email and it came from me, but she didn't click on the email and realized it was from some kind of, scammer. And I called her up. I said, I don't want Target gift cards.
Well, luckily she called you, right? That's a smart move. Not everybody makes that move. Actually, if we actually calculated this, if you took all the gift card scams and payroll diversions, meaning I need my next paycheck at this account, and you added up just the blocked ones that we do every day, it's tens of millions of dollars worth. And they don't need a high success rate in order for those things to work.
So true. And of course, one of the things that I didn't necessarily see, but I'm reminded of it all the time. Training obviously is essential, but insider threat. You're not only as weak as your quote unquote weakest employee or least trained employee, but if someone does have access to your crown jewel assets and they have malicious intentions, if they already know the passwords, it's insider threat. So you do have to monitor your employees, and sometimes they say your employees are sometimes your biggest enemies, so you have to monitor them, unfortunately. Yeah,
and I think that's an area in which there has been some progress made, mostly because that was always classically viewed as sort of a DLP problem. You have to be able to use classification to figure out exactly what the crown jewels were and anywhere that they could possibly be moving. It's really thought of as sort of a data-centric issue. Most organizations now have shifted to thinking of it as a user-centric issue, as you said, so that user activity that looks malicious is actually much more identifiable than a piece of ephemeral data like floating around and trying to figure out everywhere that it goes. So if you have a user pulling down a file from a corporate repository that matters, renaming that file, putting it in a zip, and putting a password on that zip, and then uploading it to OneDrive,
Yeah.
Just that pattern is super risky. It doesn't actually even matter if you could successfully identify the file as your crown jewels. So being able to kind of shift that mindset has been a huge, huge benefit in the fight against insider threats. And I think a lot of people have said the last couple of months have created sort of the perfect storm for insider threat, because
Sure.
you've got people worried about their job security. You've got people working from home and away from a lot of the traditional controls. And they're also away from the social pressures that they might have felt working inside an office to not do something that puts those crown jewels at risk.
They're not stealing paper clips. They're stealing your data.
Right.
Right.
A lot easier to resell the data than the paper clips.
Yeah. Okay. So we have, okay, this is interesting. We have a question from Kristen. Google and cybercrimesupport.org just launched scamspotter.org with a focus on COVID scams and not sending gift cards as one of the 3 golden rules. Any comment on that? Do you know of these organizations? Cybercrime Support?
Yeah, that is a new effort, and it's certainly a worthy one. There's lots of different organizations trying to raise the alarm about this. I think unfortunately the timing is a little off, because we're actually now on the decline of the COVID threat wave. So most of the gift card scams have mutated into other things, and really this goes to one of the points that Ryan McFarland was making. What we really have to be aware of is all of the ways in which access can be monetized, or in which cybercriminals can successfully get money without actually doing the work of laundering it. And so gift card scams are not going away anytime soon, and they're just going to follow the news story of the day. So the lures are probably going to change. We're going to see a lot of political ones as we get into election season, and it'll just require continued vigilance. That said, crowdsourcing awareness on these sorts of things is not a bad thing. We have the benefit, obviously, of over 100,000 customers where we see email threats going to them at really, really big scale. And so we can find those things ourselves. But from a consumer perspective, efforts like the Google one are certainly worthy. I would say it's a good augmentation to what IC3 is already doing. I actually got into InfoSec in the late 90s when I was in college, working to help set up IC3. So I would certainly say that even the players that have been in the game for a really long time are still doing very worthy things on all these topics.
Okay, we have another one here from Andrew regarding Office 365 threat stealing OAuth tokens. Please provide links to investigate details.
We published a bunch of research on this, and I'll throw the links into the follow-up here. But what there's really been a proliferation of is basically, again, Azure apps that are in the O365 web store. If you don't have Microsoft's CASB product, known as MCAS, which is part of the E5 license, there's actually not a great way to control and even have visibility into what your users have connected their O365 accounts to. And those take a lot of different forms. There's browser extensions and mobile apps and some things that they probably actually need to do their jobs. But again, we've been monitoring about 140 of these, and Microsoft doesn't seem to be very good at catching things that are very transparently imitating OneDrive or SharePoint or legitimate Microsoft properties. One of the most widespread ones is sold on the forums as a kit called Lotus Blue. And it is the sort of thing that we've now, again, seen about 140 different flavors of in just the last couple of months. So if you have O365 and you have E3, it's a bit painful to get into the console and look at all these things. If you have an actual CASB, whether it's the Proofpoint CASB or some other CASB, they should be providing you visibility into that. And that, of course, extends to Microsoft's CASB as well. But I'll drop a link to some of that research into the follow-up. Oh, Bradford, you're on mute.
Yes, when you submit your final set of slides, we're going to upload those to Cyber Summit USA, and you can provide any additional information. I just shared your contact information with the 300 executives that are on, so they can follow up with you. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us, and we appreciate it, and appreciate you, of course, and I love the fact there was a lot of education there. We look forward to seeing you hopefully at one of our live events, maybe in 2021.
Fingers crossed. Thanks, Roger.
Right. Fingers crossed. Take care, Ryan. And we're going to tee up our next expert. Okay. Alex, are you there?
Yes, Brad, can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you
See me?
perfectly. Yes. Can I see you? Oh, there you are.
Wonderful.
Perfect. I like your shirt. That's great.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Looking good. All right. You've got the floor around 20 minutes or so, and then we'll tap in for some Q&A.
All right.
All
Sounds
right.
perfect. Thanks everyone for the time, obviously. And the topic that, we, CyberArk as an organization, and the topic that I'll be covering for the next 20 minutes or so is really around what Ryan Callenber was talking about, specifically around protecting those crown jeweled assets, right? How do we limit that access as much as possible, or start adopting more principles for how that access should be leveraged in a more secure manner? But specifically, I'm here to talk to you about something I absolutely love, a passion of mine, and that is cloud computing. Because cloud computing has really changed the game, I think, in giving us flexibility and velocity previously thought just unimaginable to produce a product or service, within our corresponding markets. And it's also introduced this concept of ephemeral, which according to Google just simply means having a very short life cycle. Now, with modern automation in general, our systems and these workloads, they exist for a matter of minutes, maybe even seconds in an environment, which presents this new challenge along with how to best secure them. And only securing those assets in kind of a just-in-time format, or rather an as-a-service format. Not to mention just the sheer amount of data that has been collected and continues to be collected. Now, I Googled this one too. The amount of new data created and collected by the end of 2020 is predicted to reach 35 zettabytes. That's 35 trillion gigabytes. And the IDC predicts that in 2025, 175 trillion gigabytes of new data will be created around the world. That's almost 5 times larger in just 5 years. And with this sheer amount of data at our disposal and regulations and privacy concerns kind of at the forefront of data protection, we have a responsibility as security practitioners and stewards of this data to protect our systems with the utmost vigilance, right? Privileged access is at the center of that focus because privilege is everywhere in the environment. Whether this is on-prem, in the cloud, and especially with these cloud transformations, these digital transformations, the increased use of automation, it all dramatically expands this attack surface. And no customer of mine, no partner is ever done with implementing PAM. And it's our responsibility, CyberArk's responsibility, to ensure customers' environments are protected, not just on-prem, but in the cloud, and not just in the office, but also when we're working remote. And so in those concepts of bring your own devices or having these remote workforces, we're looking at areas that we can start introducing security controls for a much more evolving and dynamic workforce. And with that same vein, it's not just about the human use. It's also about automation. These automation processes that require highly sensitive secrets and credentials to do their job with that same velocity that I mentioned just a few moments ago. And the first thing that I ask any new client when we are talking about securing the cloud is, do you have control of your cloud provider's root account? Do you allow your cloud architects and admins to use this account? Can you tell me who has used it in the past 30 days? And finally, do you protect it with multi-factor authentication? And then the last question that I usually ask, if you answered yes to any or all of those questions, is how do you know? How do we provide a level of detail around that sort of high-level, crown jewel level access and information? Because to hand over these credentials is to hand over the keys to the data center, like we talked about. It's unrestricted access to everything in the environment, everything in this cloud hosted world. And so A best practice is simply to limit who has access to these credentials as much as possible. Now, who has access to something is very different from what has access. And the answer to what should have access to those root credentials, should be absolutely nothing. On one end, we're talking about the who, we're talking about the human use, we're talking about the flesh and blood, people that need to leverage this level of access for break glass sort of scenarios. On the opposite side of the coin, we're talking about automated processes. And as we talked about already, automation is everything. If you're not automating your job as a technologist, you're falling behind. And the cloud has simply given us a platform to automate anything at our disposal. Automation is not bad. Automation is great. It's fantastic. It makes our lives easier. But privilege scope, when not controlled, is what we want to stay away from. And we should scope automation with the same level of least privilege that we would apply to our end users. And so I love that Ryan Caliber really talked about this process as well in the last in his discussion. Really talking about what can be done, and some of the overarching concepts can also be applied to implementing a PAM program. So anytime that we're talking through the initial steps of building a PAM program, it's all about the discovery, the vaulting, the rotating of these existing credentials. There's always going to be a break glass or built-in sort of admin account or credential, whether it's a password or a secret or a key or a token. Something will need protecting and rotating in a dynamic repository, not a static spreadsheet, but a dynamic repository. And then on top of that, we always want to ensure that multi-factor is placed on top of this solution as well, on top of that dynamic repository. In fact, it's very interesting to hear Ryan Caliber talk about the OAuth token and that sophisticated phishing attempt to compromise that, right? The virtual or OAuth token is effectively the first secret in the chain of multi-factor authentication, which we can also think about vaulting and rotating on a regular basis as well. But as we start to implement these processes, we can start to look at additional controls, monitoring and isolating credentials, utilizing a concept called privileged session management, where effectively we're giving users access to a temporary privileged session as opposed to the underlying credential itself. And Ryan also mentioned this in lines with the phishing and education programs of isolating that type of access, isolating the credential from ever even introducing it to the endpoint or the workstation, and therefore limiting its ability to even be compromised, because the password, the credential, the key itself never actually makes its way on the potentially compromised or phished workstation. And we can do this in a just-in-time or ad hoc based workflow, but all with a concept around a role-based access model, and started to implement that idea around least privilege as it pertains to several roles or administrative technical roles within the organization. Lastly, we want to finally take a look at programmatic risk-based action against anomalies in the organization, in the environment, with real-time analytics and response to stop these attacks in progress as they progress. And we can't do that until we have adopted and introduced these controls. And so our goal is actually to introduce them in an operationally feasible way. When cloud applications became just a business driver of the business needing a quick time to market, go-to-market strategy, and a solution, service, or product that was able to do so efficiently and quickly, there was little to no security involved in that original design. Just developers being creative and innovative with the technology at their disposal. And so the easiest way for cloud users and admins to work is simply by accessing the application using a browser. But I think that nowadays we can all agree that security teams are starting to understand that securing privileged access is a basic need, right, at the very beginning, but that we can't exactly provide a solution because we don't want to be disruptive, right? There's always that trade-off between usability, operational efficiency, and security in general. And so our challenge is to transparently apply, these well-known security controls to the cloud applications where native access is key for that whole adoption strategy. So picture this. Imagine that we could actually let our cloud infrastructure team continue to access the AWS console by simply navigating to the URL, console.aws.amazon.com, while at the same time implementing true credential isolation and monitoring with workflow enforcement justification, so an approval process. But it's all native. It's all native to the browser. It's all built into the solution, and there's no interruption whatsoever. You can also see, or you can start thinking about how we could replicate this out for, let's say, securing the marketing team's access to the sensitive corporate Twitter account or other social media platforms on behalf of the organization. And kind of see where I'm going with this. You could probably come up with numerous other examples, but the idea is very much the same in that we want to limit that operational overhead as much as possible. This concept of transparent and operationally feasible security controls can be applied to users just the same way that it can be applied to automation. And so native and seamless workflow process adoption techniques, not only are they very effective, but they're also very quick wins from a risk reduction standpoint, because what we're doing is we're implementing these techniques that have a heavy impact on our production workloads, but don't require a heavy re-architecture of the code or an overhaul of the underlying development process. And so where we've kind of introduced that idea here is with this concept called secretless. And secretless.io is a free solution. Feel free to navigate there. But basically, we don't need to use passwords at all in our code or in our applications. What we effectively have introduced here is a secure broker that sits in between the application and the back-end service and handles all that authentication process. And so we're limiting what pieces of the stack itself require privileged access, while also not requiring, again, those heavy code changes or development overhaul just to get these controls, these security controls in place and reduce risk. Same goes for some of the commercial off-the-shelf software, and these are existing integrations. These secure your existing workloads with limited complexity. These are already processes that are in place. They make our lives easier. RPA is a huge part of the automation, process that I think, we as technologists are starting to adopt, and it's something that we CYBERARK have identified as something that we would like to partner with. Right? We've built integrations. We've partnered with and identified numerous other vendors that our customers and clientele are actively utilizing and building their process and workforce around, so that we want to do our part in securing those applications' need for privileged access. And so, again, those RPA tools, vulnerability scanners, they require no code change whatsoever or an overhaul because of our partnership with these vendors, and we've taken care of that whole process. And so, the last, or rather, as we're kind of getting into where possible, I'll say, we want to apply the principles of least privilege, right? I think there's definitely an overarching, mindset here between myself and Ryan Kallenberg touched on this as well, around the idea of least privilege, right? Only scoping what is necessary for the users and also from an automation standpoint. So we want to apply that to the cloud. Now, the problem, or the challenge with the cloud is that you need to be very precise. You need to be very precise in all three aspects of the identity, the permissions, and the target scope. And it's quite hard to do this properly without breaking that concept of least privilege, that principle of least privilege, only scoping what is necessary that doesn't lead to misconfiguration issues. In fact, one of the main reasons for this complexity is that Azure has more than 5,000, Azure and O365 have more than 5,000 different permissions that can be used and assigned, okay? And so what we've actually noticed common in our research, we've actually prioritized the most sensitive permissions and created the following list, okay, just to kind of give you an idea. And every user that has only one of those permission lines could escalate their permissions and become a full admin over the entire subscription, just with those right permissions. They give you the ability to modify the authorization properties of the subscription itself. And it would be, I think this goes without saying, devastating for an attacker to gain control over one of those users who has those types of permissions. So what we're kind of adopting here, this concept of a shadow admin, it inadvertently creates overprivileged access in the cloud environment. Now, rest assured, we do have some tools at your disposal. There's a free tool called SkyArk. You can download it from GitHub. It's managed, maintained by our CYBERARK Labs team. But it is a great tool that will help in identifying overprivileged access and roles in a multi-cloud provider environment, right? Not just looking at one individually, but looking at, in a multi-cloud provider environment, how can we establish this least privilege concept across the entire environment, right? The entire cloud, and identify and report on that overprivilege and those shadow admins in a nice human-readable format. And then Kabura is our latest offering that will not only identify overprivilege in the multi-cloud provider environment, but also correct it, okay? And we'll have some resources on this towards the end. I'll be able to share some links. Last but not least, or rather as I kind of leave you today, I'd like to enforce the fundamentals of building a PAM program. Our tried and true method for deploying PAM with success that builds adoption and eliminates risk. This is also known as Blueprint. You can go ahead and grab a copy of the blueprint itself, cyberark.com/blueprint. As I mentioned, PAM is an ever-evolving process, a program rather. Nobody is ever quite done. In fact, as technologists, as we begin to build, faster, more agile stacks and programs and solutions, in the marketplace, we're only adding additional attack vectors, and so it's important that we build PAM into the foundation itself to ensure that we're successful in the future and we're also safeguarded against those types of attacks. And so again, feel free to. My email didn't make it into. There it is. I ask that you consider. So last thing I'd like to mention. I ask that each and every one of you consider adopting just consistent controls and visibility across both on-prem and cloud workloads, and also to build a program around least privilege. Right. That's kind of the most important part. Is this idea of least privilege, and there's a number of resources available at your disposal, that are listed here. But also feel free to reach out to myself, alex.flores@cyberark.com. I'm always constantly talking about these things. I'm a nerd when it comes to security and privileged access specifically. So I welcome any and all discussions. But most importantly, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present today. I know everybody's time now more than ever is extremely valuable. So thank you.
Hey, Alex, I just shared your email with with everyone there, so everyone could follow up with you. A couple of questions that we had regarding your slides. Can we share any of these slides on Cyber Summit USA after the webcast in a couple of days?
Of course. What I'll do is I'll send over a copy of the slides just so that we have it in a nice, clean format.
Great.
That we'll be able to share out.
Terrific. Yeah, a PDF is great, and we can share that with everyone. Again, for follow-up with Alex and CyberArk, you can check in the chat box that we've just shared with everybody. So you're all set to go. Any specific tips, as I asked the other experts, as people migrate back to the office, aside from, BYOD, obviously people have some new laptops, new cell phones and so forth. Anything that you, with your experience, could share as best practices as people migrate back?
I would love to, Brad. And really, I think that as we as people, again, I say this a lot, as technologists, as we evolve, especially in the workforce, I think that we're going to start to see that it's going to be quite difficult and almost impossible to control every single device that might make its way into the network, into the environment. And really, in my focus lately, has been less on the device side and more on the identity side, where and it really comes down to this basic principle that if you can identify with 100% certainty, now that's the key point, 100% certainty that who is accessing what is happening in your environment, you'll significantly reduce risk in the environment, right? And so that zero trust concept, really ingraining multi-factor into every aspect of not just privileged access, but access to company resources, as a whole, is a huge part of, as we make that transition back, starting to look at, what tools are at our disposal from an identity perspective, and how do we ensure that anybody who's accessing these company resources is who they say they are, right? And they have justification around why they should be accessing that as well.
Well, since you are a self-proclaimed nerd technologist,
certainly.
I'm going to start asking this question to all of our experts in the commercial sector. Aside from law enforcement, ransomware has been on a rampant rise, obviously. What would you personally recommend if to the mid-sized business owner? Obviously, the larger companies have certain protocols and incident response plans, but for the small to medium-sized business that's being held hostage for the quintessential $2,000, something that's underneath the radar, not enough for the FBI, not enough for the Secret Service, but in that $2,000 to $5,000 or $10,000 range, what's their first action? What is their first, activity? They've gotten locked down. Their data is at risk. What do you do?
Well, so I think, really the question is, I'll say, or rather what I would want to focus on is more the proactive steps to ensure that we don't get to that point, right?
Sure.
And those proactive steps specifically, again, coming back to this idea, this concept of least privilege. Just because we want to be local admin on our machines and install everything that we want doesn't necessarily mean that we should, right? We should have proper business justification in place. And within that same vein, when it comes to, let's say we are being phished or spear-phished for sensitive assets or sensitive access in the environment, we can also basically say with 100% certainty that the endpoint, the workstation, is the most insecure piece of the entire puzzle, if you will, the entire piece of the organization. That's how the attackers are making their way in. And so if we can shut off as much sensitive information that makes its way onto the workstation as possible, we're taking great steps in securing that process. And so this really comes back to that idea that that Ryan had mentioned in the previous presentation, and I had sort of mentioned midway through mine around isolation and isolating our users from the underlying privileged credential or underlying secure access, and actually giving them more of a just-in-time or sort of a temporary privilege session that is almost as ephemeral as anything else in the environment that will go away once they're done with it.
Great. Good use of an SAT word as well. All right.
Sure.
Our last question or comment, Molly says, success of bad actors is puzzling. Is it because backup disaster restore processes are undervalued?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Success, it's right on, it should be also on your Q&A.
Oh, I got it, yep.
success of bad actors is puzzling. Is it because backup disaster restorers are undervalued?
I think that's a challenging question to answer. Of what is causing success of bad actors? It could be a number of things, right? So one thing that we didn't really address in this presentation, but Ryan before him mentioned in the previous ones, was the malicious insider, right?
Yeah.
The disgruntled employee, right? And that also comes back to that identity portion where it really is not about identify but validate, but it really is a zero trust model that we would like to implement. And with that, multi-factor everywhere. And so putting together the not only the most secure but operationally feasible workloads that allow our users to gain access to sensitive systems, but do so in a repeatable format. And so in that, again, I'm kind of getting off topic here, but regardless, certainly backup and disaster recovery processes are key to business continuity practices, and also key to securing this level of access as well. We want to make sure that we're architecting from the very beginning those sort of BCP principles in mind.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Alex.
Thank you for having me.
And we're going to tee up our next speaker. Hopefully, we'll see you at one of our conferences in the future.
Looking forward to it.
You got it. All right, let's go to our final presentation from the Department of Homeland Security, their division called CISA, with Antonio. Antonio, can you hear us?
I can hear you fine, and I'll turn my camera on at the end of the presentation.
So that people can see the clown outfit you're in.
Absolutely.
Excellent. All right. I think you now have the control, and there you are. Thank you so much again for joining us and your service to our country. And the floor is yours. We still have almost 300 people looking to hear all the tools and best practices that you'd like to discuss.
All right, sounds good. So again, my name's Tony Enriquez, and I work for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And I'm one of 3 cybersecurity advisors for Region 5. Region 5 consists of Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin. And I'm based out of Chicago. So today I'll be talking about our agency, CISA, what we do for a living. I'll talk a little bit about ransomware and then talk about what our agency can provide to help you better manage your cybersecurity program. So in theory, by the end of the presentation, hopefully you can find 1 or 2 resources that you can leverage to help increase and manage your cybersecurity posture. Come on, slide. There we go. So again, CISA, we're the self-proclaimed nation's risk advisor. Through our efforts to understand and advise on cyber and physical risks to the nation's critical infrastructure, we're helping partners strengthen their own capabilities. So we're connecting stakeholders in industry and government to each other, to resources, to share analysis, and to tools to help them improve their resilience from a cyber perspective, a communications perspective, and a physical security perspective. Today, I'd like to focus on the cyber mission. So we're responsible for protecting the federal agencies, the .govs. We assist in protecting the private sector, the .coms, along with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, and finally, the critical infrastructure owners and operators. So we're looking at threats, we're analyzing them, and then creating situational awareness. And then we exchange this information with organizations who need it, either human to human or machine to machine. And when requested, we coordinate incident response. And next, I'll talk about the Cybersecurity Advisor Program. We accomplish our mission by providing outreach through direct coordination, regional support to protect cyber components essential to the nation's critical infrastructure. So the CSA program promotes cybersecurity preparedness, risk mitigation, incident and response capabilities of our stakeholders through various activities, which include conducting risk-based assessments, such as our cyber resilience review, promoting the use of best practices like the NIST cybersecurity framework, building private-public cybersecurity partnerships through information exchanges and cyber protective visits. We're raising awareness of various cybersecurity services offered by CISA and other federal and local government programs through our resilience workshops, our panel discussions, and our program briefs. We're listening to stakeholder requirements through various working groups and other technical exchanges. And we're also coordinating direct assistance and resourcing support during times of cyber threats, disruptions, and attacks. And our cybersecurity advisor program is also growing. I'm up in Region 5. The stars indicate where we have CSAs throughout the United States. And hopefully by the end of the year, we're going to have 24 more people to shore up the program. All right, let's talk about resilience. Now, I think Ryan, and Alex did a great job at talking about who's targeting you. And of course, it's a cybersecurity brief, so you have to have that mandatory slide of a guy in a hoodie. So the point here is that it doesn't matter who's under the hoodie. It could be a nation state, it could be a cyber criminal, it could be a hacktivist group. As Alex mentioned, it could be that malicious insider, or it could be just some of the bored high school kids doing what high school kids do. So as we go through the following slides, hopefully it becomes evident that the defense against ransomware is not going to change based on the identity of the attacker. Okay, so what is ransomware? On the off chance you're not familiar with what ransomware is, it's a type of malicious encryption software that denies the user access to their system and typically attempts to extort victims through an on-screen message that provides instructions on how to pay the ransom and how much is required. Users are told unless the ransom is paid, your files will be lost forever or made available to the public. And the payment's usually in the form of some virtual currency like Bitcoin. Ransomware by the numbers. Cost of ransomware in the United States back in 2019 was more than $7 billion. That's a 56% growth from 2018, and they're estimating to continue with a projected $6 trillion in cost of cybercrime worldwide by 2021, of which ransomware makes up a significant portion. All right, evolution of ransomware. I'm going to kind of go through this slide fairly quickly. The first reported ransomware attack was a virus created by a biologist, Joseph Pop. He created the AIDS Trojan and might also be known as the PC cyborg. And if you remember what a 3.5-inch floppy disk was, this was what was circulated as an AIDS introductory diskette through a World Health Organization AIDS conference. And after the diskette was used a certain number of times, the program would execute, hide the file directories, encrypt files on the C drive, and then to regain access, the user would have to contact the PC Cyborg Corporation and then send $189 to a PO box in Panama. Excuse me. Fast forward to 2013, we've got CryptoLocker. The primary infection method for CryptoLocker was spear phishing emails made to look like communications from a payroll department or legitimate companies like UPS, DHL, and FedEx. And then upon infecting the system, eventually CryptoLocker begins to encrypt any files that the user has access to, including data on shared drives. And once the damage is done to the affected files, it's typically irreversible. It's estimated that CryptoLocker made over $27 million. And more alarming ransomware where variants began to target the widespread of vulnerabilities based on hardware and software products, such as the WannaCry ransom outbreak, which used the Windows Eternal Blue exploit to infect hundreds of thousands of computers and networks in hundreds of countries. Come on, slide. There we go. Again, just real basic slide. It's often spread by victims opening phishing emails that contain attachments or downloads. Again, going back to the previous speakers, talking about the lures or some of the subjects of the emails, that included stimulus check information, N95 mask distribution, coronavirus vaccinations, telecommuting best practices, and as Ryan mentioned, sexual harassment. When we talk about the drive-by downloading, that occurs when you unknowingly visit an infected website where the malware is downloaded and then installed without your knowledge. Common consequences to organizations that fall victim to ransomware are temporary or permanent loss of sensitive information, disruption to regular operations, financial loss incurred from lost business or operations. It could be financial loss due to regulatory fines, the cost to restore the systems and files, and finally, harm to your organization's reputation. All right, so what can you do to help defend yourself today? So these are some of the basic things that you can do. In the case of ransomware, the key to resilience are your backups. Ensure that they're not accessible or attached to the network where the attacker could land, and your backups should be tested prior to restoration. One, to ensure that you know how to restore your backups properly, and two, to make sure that you're not restoring data that contains the ransomware. Next up, we have patching. Again, we want you to update your software and your operating systems with the latest patches. Outdated applications and outdated operating systems are the target of most attacks. This also includes updating your security solutions. So in a perfect world, you would have time to test the patches and updates to make sure that they don't break something else. Incident response plans. These will help you in the moment of attack by providing those predefined options, such as being able to make that rapid change to your network to isolate the infected computer. So again, you need these response plans to help you in the reducing the spread and reach of the ransomware, and the recovery plans help you prioritize your restoration. Knowing what high value assets and systems to bring up first, second, third, and so on, it's not something you want to figure out in the moment of crisis. And then if you do have that incident response plan, review it and test it at least annually to ensure that it's still applicable to your organization's personnel and your critical services. So what happens if you become a victim? First, don't feel that you're alone in this particular incident, and don't let a bad day get worse. Contact federal law enforcement, whether it's the Secret Service or FBI. You can contact CISA. We can bring resources to assist in the response and recovery efforts, and we may have encountered the same variants of ransomware previously. Second, work with experienced personnel to aid in recovery. Ideally, they are already identified in your response plan prior to experiencing that incident. Third, upon discovery, isolate the infected system or systems to prevent further propagation of the malware. You also want to review any connections that you have to third-party partners that have access to your network, to include customers, partners, vendors. You want to identify your upstream and downstream vulnerabilities and impacts. And then finally, apply that business impact analysis to your environment and your assets. Understand what your interdependencies are surrounding your business and which aspects are more critical to effectively triage your recovery efforts. Okay, actions to secure your environment going forward. We talked a lot about user education, training of your workforce, performing offline backups, patching, process reviews. All of these actions contribute towards making an attacker's job more difficult. To make it even more difficult for the attackers, don't institute a flat network where all of your organizational departments are accessible. Segment where you can and restrict access to the least amount used or needed for your users. Item number 3, develop containment strategies. So 3 becomes easier if you're segmenting your network. work that into your incident response plan on how to isolate the infected systems to contain the infection and minimize the impact to the overall network. And if the bad guys do get in, make it hard for them to get stuff out. Number 4, baselines. It's extremely difficult to identify abnormal activity without understanding what's normal. So baseline your network, understand normal network and host behavior so you can increase your chances to recognize intrusions. And then number 5, review and test your incident response plan. That's just something that you really need to do. This way, if you're testing your incident response plan, the people who are tasked to carry it out, they know who they are, who their backups are, they know what their responsibilities are, and they know what the expectations are once the plan's completed or executed correctly. Okay, ransomware resources. I've got a few web links for you. If you or your fellow employees need an option for awareness training, we offer a ransomware briefing designed for non-technical personnel. So again, if you're looking for that last-minute requirement for ransomware awareness training, you can go to our website. The U.S. government created a response framework in an interagency technical guide document, how to protect your networks from ransomware. The summary of the key best practices is seen in the left-hand column, and it's available at that web link. More ransomware resources are available at these sites here. Okay, and we also have something called Cyber Essentials. It's a guide for leaders of small businesses as well as leaders of small and local government agencies to develop an actionable understanding of where to start implementing organizational cybersecurity practices. So as the name implies, the initiative focuses on the very basic steps on what an organization needs to do to get started on the road to cyber resilience. So the document's a starting point for leaders and their organizations to get into the mindset of understanding and addressing cyber risks and other operational risks. It's a set of modules designed to break down the Cyber Essentials into bite-sized actions, both for your information technology shop and your senior leadership, to work towards that full implementation of each Cyber Essential. So each chapter focuses on the recommended actions to build cyber readiness into the 6 interrelated aspects of an organizational culture for cyber readiness. So if you're a senior manager and you need another way to view why cybersecurity is important in your organization, or you just need to maybe tame it down or dumb it down for folks who don't understand cybersecurity, this PDF could help you better understand the basics. And if you're looking for it, the URL is in the bottom right-hand corner. Okay, incident response. So who do you call? If you have a cyber incident and you don't have anyone to call for help, you can call CISA Central. There's our toll-free number. CISA Central is the new term which was formerly known as the NPIC. It's our 24/7 operations center. Again, but I do want to state that this is not to circumvent your existing local relationships with federal law enforcement. Again, FBI, Secret Service, state and local law enforcement. Your first call might be to your security vendor. So I'm asking you to make sure that if you haven't already created these connections, please do. You don't want to meet them for the first time at an incident. But if you don't have anyone to call, you can give us a call or go to www.cisa.gov and press on the yellow button labeled Report Cyber Issue. Okay, and I know Bradford mentioned the free resources that we can provide. I do want to state that these cybersecurity assessments are meant for our stakeholders within the critical infrastructure. So there's 16 sectors. For the most part, everyone does fall into one of the 16 sectors. And because these are free resources, some of the availability on these resources could be limited. But I do want to talk about two. The first one is our vulnerability scanning. This is where we scan your internet-facing network devices for known vulnerabilities and then provide you a report of what we find. So if you need help with vulnerability management on your internet-facing devices, we can help you there. We also have the Cyber Resilience Review. This is an interview-based assessment which helps you understand the maturity of your cybersecurity program. So it's taking a look at how you run your cybersecurity program, your policies, plans, and procedures from a business perspective. So if you need a way to determine whether or not your cybersecurity management plan is mature, we can help you there as well. And I know, I think it was Bradford who mentioned our penetration tests. We do have two flavors. One is a risk and vulnerability assessment, and the second one is a remote penetration test. The RVA is a 2-week engagement where we do typical remote reconnaissance for roughly a week, and then the second week is actually on site. This is where we do some social engineering, look for unknown Wi-Fi signals or unknown wireless signals, and basically do what we can to break into your network. The remote penetration test is basically that first portion of the RVA. So over the course of a week, we'll do everything we can to break into your network over the wire. The remote penetration test is not designed to be low and slow. It's going to be loud because we only have a certain amount of time to conduct the engagement. So back to the RVA and RPT, if you're looking for a free penetration test in a short time frame, we are probably not the best fit for you. So I just do want to state that out. There is a fairly long queue for the more technical penetration tests. And again, all of the resources on the slide are available at no cost to your organizations. If you're looking for more information, we have our Cyber Resource Hub. If you'd rather deal with me, you can also send me an email and ask for more information. We also have our National Cyber Awareness System. Earlier, I talked about situational awareness. This is where you can go for our alerts, bulletins, and analysis reports. And if you want to, you can also subscribe to them. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Okay, Tony, thank you so much for joining us. Let me just put on my, I always forget to slide the shade over. Okay, thank you so much. Oh, yep, there you are. Look at you.
All right.
Looking good. But you have a bathing suit on, right? From
You're only seeing from the waist up today.
Most newscasters have the suit on top, and then God knows what's below.
Oh, no comment.
Yes, absolutely. I've been getting just really a lot of requests for the slides, and we'll be able to post up your contact information and your slides up on the website in approximately 2 days. The typical question we always get is, when do they actually contact you in the case of a breach? Is it prevention or post-incident?
So specifically when they're contacting me, this is more on the prevention and mitigation side. Again, I'm sort of the boots on the ground for my agency in the Midwest to make sure that we're able to provide awareness of the different resources we have, whether it's through CISA, the FBI, or Secret Service, and then create them, come up with a portfolio of some of the different resources to help them understand where they can use assistance. If we're talking about contacting for a cyber incident,
yep,
I would refer back to, let me see if I can go back to the slide here. Going back and calling CISA Central. If I am contacted about a cybersecurity incident, I would recommend to that stakeholder to, if they're comfortable going to CISA, they can call our toll-free number or go to that CISA.gov. What people may not know is at our Security Operations Center back in Virginia, we have liaison officers from the FBI, from the intelligence community, from the Department of Defense. So we have a lot of the players within the intelligence community and federal law enforcement. So if we get a report or of an incident and we find out that it's really not in our lane, we can make that recommendation to the person calling in that they should contact the FBI. And if they're not sure how to do that, we literally have an FBI liaison officer, sitting 2 rows down. So we can be considered that one-stop shop. But then if you're more comfortable talking to federal law enforcement or your state and locals or your security vendor, that's okay as well.
Terrific. Listen, we hope to have you at some of our real conferences when we're in front of 500 people. Tony, thank you so much for your time and your service to our country. And stay safe. Wash your hands, and hopefully we'll see you in the very, very near future. Thank you again for your time and your great presentation.
All right, thanks for the invite.
Oh, my pleasure. And to those that are still with us, thank you for joining us. In approximately 2 days, you'll get your certificate of completion for today's Power Hour. We have another one in 2 days on June 25th, and you can use that same code that you had used for this one for the one on Thursday. We have the slide up that we're going to keep up there for another minute with follow-up contact information. We'll also have most of this information on our website, cybersummitusa.com. At the end of July, we are going to start our virtual Cyber Summit series. So the full complete cybersecurity summit, a day-long event with 40 different cyber solutions companies, dozens of speakers. We hope to see you then. Details, of course, are on our website. And we appreciate you staying with us today and submitting your questions and comments. And on that note, I wish you all safety and health as we migrate back to our offices. And we will see you at the next Power Hour and hopefully at the next Cybersecurity Summit. You take care. Bye-bye.
We created IoT Nation to help professionals like you navigate the IoT space, to find the companies, people, use cases, and events that are most relevant for you. On IoT Nation, you can browse over 25,000 IoT-related companies and dive into the details for specific ones. You can also search geographically, zoom into any area of the map, and explore companies in any city. You can find applications in various verticals, such as smart buildings, smart cities, connected mobility, and many more. And you can plan your week and month ahead by searching dozens of online and offline events to find the ones that are most relevant for you. For all Cyber Summit Power Hour attendees, we are offering free use of IoT Nation Pro for 30 days with the code CYBER2020V. If you have any questions, contact us at info@iotnation.com.